It was a cold December evening, the kind where the air bites at your cheeks, but the warmth of home makes it all feel like a distant memory. The Williams family gathered in their cozy living room, their laughter echoing softly through the walls of their modest home. The Christmas tree sparkled in the corner, its lights twinkling like stars, casting a soft glow on the faces of the family. The kids, Jacob and Maya, were sprawled on the couch, half-heartedly watching a movie, their eyes more focused on the clock than the screen, eagerly awaiting the arrival of the new year. Their father, Malcolm Williams, sat in his favorite chair by the fireplace, a quiet smile on his face as he watched his children. At 45, Malcolm had built a life for his family through years of hard work, always making sure they had everything they needed. His wife, Tina, was bustling around the kitchen, preparing a late-night snack. She was a strict but loving woman, fiercely protective of her children, and even though she wasn't showing it, she couldn't help but feel a little anxious about the year ahead. Malcolm and Tina had worked hard to give their children a better life than they had, and they cherished every moment together. Tonight was supposed to be peaceful, a simple celebration of another year, another set of memories to look back on. But as the hours ticked down to midnight, an eerie silence seemed to settle over the house. It was as if the world outside had gone quiet, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The soft crackle of the fire was the only sound that filled the room. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his mind drifting to the coming year. He had big plans for the family, hopes of a promotion at work, new opportunities to give his kids everything they deserved. But as much as he wanted to think about the future, there was a nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. He couldn't quite shake it. "Mom, are we having our midnight toast tonight?" Maya's voice broke through his thoughts, and Malcolm chuckled. "Of course, sweetheart. We'll wait for your father to stop thinking about work and enjoy the moment," Tina replied, her voice light and teasing. Malcolm smiled, but the nagging feeling didn't go away. It was strange. But he didn't think too much of it, just the kind of anxiety everyone feels before the new year, right? Then, as the clock struck 11:50 p.m., the first jarring sound shattered the calm, a loud crash from the back of the house. Malcolm's heart raced, and the room fell silent. The laughter stopped. The clock ticked on, but everything seemed to freeze. He stood up quickly, his eyes scanning the room. Tina froze in place, the knife she was holding falling to the floor with a sharp clang. Maya and Jacob looked to him, their faces confused but filled with the same sudden fear he felt. "What was that?" Jacob asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Malcolm said, his calm demeanor masking the panic he felt rising in his chest. He motioned for the kids to stay in the living room, then moved toward the back door with purpose. Before he could reach it, the sound came again, this time, more violent. The back door crashed open, and the unmistakable voices of men, shouting and demanding something, filled the air. Malcolm's blood ran cold as the front door was slammed open as well. Two masked men rushed into the living room, their faces hidden, their eyes cold with intent. Malcolm's heart stopped as he realized that the safe haven of his home had just been breached. The intruders weren't here for a quick robbery. They were here for something else, something far more sinister. "Stay down," one of the men barked, waving a gun in their direction. "Don't make a sound, and no one gets hurt." Malcolm's instincts kicked in, and a surge of adrenaline coursed through him. He looked at his family. Tina's eyes were wide with terror, Jacob clutched his sister's arm tightly, both of them paralyzed by fear. But Malcolm wasn't going to let them take what was his. "Just stay calm," he whispered to Tina. "We'll get through this." The night that was supposed to be filled with joy and laughter had suddenly become a nightmare. And as the men moved closer, Malcolm's mind raced, trying to figure out how to protect his family. There was no time to think. He had to act. This begins the peaceful scene leading up to the break-in. The family dynamic and their normal, joyful celebration are clearly established, followed by the sudden, violent shift into danger as the burglars invade. The tension begins to rise, and it sets up the rest of the plot, where Malcolm and his family will need to survive against the intruders. Malcolm's pulse raced as the intruders stepped deeper into the house, their eyes darting around the living room like hunters scanning their prey. The leader of the two men, tall and imposing, pointed the gun at Malcolm, his fingers twitching on the trigger. "Where's the safe?" he growled, his voice low and menacing. Malcolm's mind scrambled. They didn't have much, nothing of significant value that could satisfy these criminals. The only thing worth anything was the old, dusty safe in the study. But that wasn't the issue. The issue was keeping his family safe. "You don't need to do this," Malcolm said, trying to keep his voice steady. He could feel the weight of his children's eyes on him, their silent plea for him to do something, to protect them. "Shut up," the other intruder yelled. He was smaller but quicker, his eyes sharp with malice as he took another step forward. "We're here for more than just money, and you're going to cooperate. Understand?" Malcolm nodded slowly, the gears in his head turning. He needed time, just a few moments to think. He could try to overpower them, but with two armed men in his house, it would be a gamble. Tina was no fighter, and the kids were too young. Their only chance was to outsmart these intruders and get the authorities involved before things got worse. "Please," Tina spoke up, her voice shaking but determined. "Take whatever you want. Just leave us be. Let us get through this night." The intruder holding the gun smiled darkly. "This is about more than just things, lady." His voice dropped an octave as he motioned toward the back door, where his partner was checking the house. "We know who you are. We know what's in that safe." Malcolm's stomach twisted. How did they know about the safe? He hadn't told anyone, not even his closest friends, about the documents he kept hidden there. His heart skipped a beat, and a cold sweat formed on his brow. Was this personal? "Why don't you just leave?" Malcolm said, trying to buy more time. "You've got the wrong house. We're just a regular family." The masked man scoffed. "Don't play dumb. We know exactly who you are. The only reason you're still breathing right now is because we're being polite. But that's about to change." As the men moved deeper into the house, Malcolm's thoughts raced. The safe was in the study, behind a hidden panel in the wall. But how could he get to it without them noticing? And if they were as familiar with the house as they seemed, they'd likely be waiting for him to make his move. Tina's eyes met his, a silent understanding passing between them. She knew her husband. She knew that he wouldn't go down without a fight. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from upstairs, the kids. Jacob had accidentally knocked over a lamp while trying to hide behind the couch, his face pale with fear. The intruder closest to the stairs spun around, his gun raised, but Malcolm was already moving. Without thinking, he grabbed a nearby coffee table, hurling it across the room toward the men. The table smashed against the wall with a deafening crack, and both intruders froze for a split second. It was all the time Malcolm needed. "Get to the kitchen." Malcolm shouted to Tina, his voice sharp. "Now." Tina didn't hesitate. She grabbed Maya by the hand, pulling her toward the back door and out of the living room. Jacob followed closely behind, his eyes wide with terror, but trusting his parents. They knew they had to run. As soon as the family began to move, Malcolm spun back around to face the intruders, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew the risk he was taking by dividing the family, but there was no other choice. He had to keep the intruders distracted long enough for Tina and the kids to escape. The taller intruder recovered first, shouting for the other one to chase after them. "Stop them," he yelled. But as the second man ran toward the kitchen, the first man kept his weapon trained on Malcolm. "This is where it ends for you," the man snarled, stepping closer. "I'll make sure you regret ever standing up to us." Malcolm was prepared. As the man advanced, he grabbed the nearest object within reach. A heavy metal sculpture from the coffee table, and swung it toward the intruder's head. The metal struck with a sickening thud, sending the man crashing to the floor, unconscious. For a moment, the room was filled with stunned silence. But it wouldn't last. Malcolm's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step back, praying that Tina and the kids were far enough away. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not even for a second. In the distance, he heard the sound of the back door opening. The other intruder had found the family. They were trapped, and he had just moments before they came back for him. This segment builds on the initial invasion, intensifying the danger the family faces. Malcolm is forced into action, making the decision to split the family up for their safety, buying time to fight back. The stakes grow higher as the first intruder is knocked out, but more danger looms ahead. Tina's heart was racing as she dragged Maya and Jacob through the narrow hallway, her mind only focused on one thing: getting them out of the house alive. The back door was their only option now. They had to get to the car, but with the intruders inside, the house was a death trap. "Stay close, kids. Keep quiet," Tina whispered, her voice strained with panic. She knew she couldn't afford to make a sound, not with those men hunting them. Maya, her 13-year-old daughter, squeezed her mother's hand, her eyes wide with fear. Jacob, the younger of the two at 9 years old, was struggling to keep up, his small legs barely keeping pace with Tina's hurried steps. Tina's mind raced, and her instincts kicked in. She had been a strict mother, yes, but this wasn't the time for discipline. This was about survival. She had always taught her children to stay calm in a crisis, but now, all she could do was keep them moving. The intruders would be on them in minutes if they didn't act fast. As they reached the kitchen, Tina paused. She motioned for the kids to stay low, then crept over to the back window. The dark night outside offered little reassurance, but it was the only escape route they had. She tried to peer through the window, but the view was obstructed by the thick curtains. "Mom, what's happening?" Jacob's voice trembled. His fear was palpable, and for a moment, Tina was unable to answer. The world outside had grown terrifyingly quiet. Was the threat closer than she thought? Suddenly, a thud echoed from the hallway. The intruder had made his way into the kitchen. Tina's breath caught in her throat as she quickly grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, holding it tightly in her grip. She didn't know how she would fight them off, but she had to try. "Stay behind me," she whispered, turning to face the kids. The seconds felt like hours. Every noise in the house now seemed magnified, each creak of the floorboards like a warning bell. Her mind raced. What if Malcolm wasn't okay? What if they were too late? What if the intruders had already caught him? The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Tina's pulse quickened. She had to act now or risk being cornered. Meanwhile, Malcolm was pacing the living room, his breath ragged. The adrenaline that had surged through him after he took down the first intruder was beginning to wear off, and the reality of the situation was sinking in. The house was too quiet. Tina and the kids were somewhere inside, but how far could they have gotten? Had they made it to the car yet? Or were the intruders already on their heels? Malcolm gritted his teeth and shook his head. There was no time to waste. He had to protect his family, no matter the cost. He quickly scanned the room for anything that could help him. The fallen intruder lay motionless on the floor, but Malcolm didn't have time to worry about him. The other man was still out there, and the second he heard any noise, he'd be back in the house, more dangerous than ever. Malcolm crouched behind the couch, his breathing shallow, and his ears straining for the sound of footsteps. He had to be ready. Back in the kitchen, Tina had a plan. The window was small, but it could offer the only escape. She quickly checked that the intruder hadn't heard them yet. With the knife in her hand, she motioned for the kids to get low to the ground. Maya nodded, her face pale but determined, while Jacob clung to his mother's side, too scared to speak. Tina slowly approached the window, her heart thudding in her chest. As she reached for the curtain to pull it back, a sudden crash of glass from the living room froze her in place. The intruder had entered the kitchen. Don't move, he barked, and Tina's heart stopped. Her worst fear had come true. The man was standing just a few feet away, a gun in his hand. Her first instinct was to run, but she couldn't leave the kids. Her grip tightened on the knife as she backed away slowly, trying to buy herself some time. She couldn't afford to be caught off guard. The man's smirk was chilling, as if he were enjoying the chaos he had created. "I told you," he said, his voice dripping with malicious satisfaction. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Tina's mind raced. She couldn't let him take them. She wouldn't. With a sudden burst of movement, Tina lunged forward, thrusting the knife toward the man. He was caught off guard, but only for a second. He dodged, and with lightning speed, grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back. The knife fell to the floor with a metallic clatter. Tina gasped in pain, but her focus never wavered. "Stay back, kids," she managed to shout through gritted teeth. She could see the fear in her children's eyes, but she knew this was her moment. This was her fight. Malcolm heard the crash from the kitchen, and his heart skipped a beat. He was too late. But he wasn't giving up now. He was a father, and his family depended on him. He sprinted down the hall, moving as quietly as possible, his body tense with anticipation. The kitchen was only a few steps away, but as he approached, he hesitated, peeking around the corner. What he saw took his breath away. Tina was struggling with the intruder, who had her pinned to the ground. She was strong, fighting back with every ounce of energy she had, but the man had the advantage. Without a second thought, Malcolm launched himself at the intruder, tackling him with all his force. The man let out a startled yell, losing his grip on Tina. Malcolm didn't hesitate. He punched the intruder square in the jaw, sending him stumbling backward. Tina scrambled to her feet, grabbing the knife that had fallen on the floor. With a look of fierce determination, she drove it into the intruder's side, sending him crashing to the ground. For a moment, there was silence, only the sound of ragged breathing filling the room. "We're not done yet," Malcolm whispered, his voice rough with emotion. The family had just fought their first battle, but there were still 2 more threats lurking in the house. This section is filled with tension as Tina and Malcolm both fight back against the intruders, using their wits and courage to protect their children. As the 2 parents battle separately but together, the stakes continue to rise, and the family's survival becomes even more uncertain. The climax builds as Malcolm arrives just in time to help Tina, shifting the power dynamic in their favor. The intruder's body lay motionless on the kitchen floor, but Tina couldn't afford to pause. The adrenaline still coursing through her veins, she quickly scanned the room, making sure that there was no immediate threat. She didn't even have time to feel the sting of the wound on her arm where the man had twisted her. There was more at stake. Malcolm knelt beside her, his face grim but resolute. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, voice tight with urgency. His protective instincts were in full gear, his body still tense from the fight. "The others will be looking for us." Tina nodded sharply, her eyes flicking toward the door, where their children huddled in fear. She knew they couldn't stay in the house any longer. There were more intruders, and every minute they spent waiting would only bring more danger. But before they could make their move, an eerie voice cut through the silence. "You're not going anywhere," the voice taunted from the shadows. It was deep, cold, and all too familiar. Tina froze, her heart in her throat. She knew that voice. The man who had been in the living room earlier, the one she had only glimpsed as he made his way through the hallway, stepped into the kitchen, a wicked smile on his face. His hands were casually tucked into the pockets of his jacket, but the gun he was holding was all too real. "Still standing, huh?" he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "I figured you'd put up a fight. But you're not getting away that easy. I know who you are, Mrs. Blackwell, and I know what you've done. You won't escape tonight."